Hi, this is Freshney here. Today I'm going to break down my track Crank. It came out on my Bloom EP a couple of months ago. I thought it'd be a good one to discuss because it's got some very prominent concepts that I think are it's quite important to go into detail about these concepts because it can really help be the driving force of writing a track. And and you see why I want to talk about the concept rather than the technicality here, because it kind of does lead into each other. Anyway, we'll go into it. I don't want to babble on for too long. So I suppose the concepts I actually want to discuss with this are the fact that it's a sort of mechanized track. It's very mechanical. It's just very disjointed. It's very jolty. And I want to talk about how that was. I went about creating that effect, really. We'll speak about that a lot, and I think it's also quite a simplistic track, which also works quite well into the sort of mechanized, jolty feel. So you don't necessarily have to go crazy in depth into it. You just have to make it feel a bit swung and that kind of thing. So I'll show you how I've done this. But first, I suppose I better show you kind of how this project's laid out. It's quite simple, really. It's quite, I suppose, how you'd imagine it to be. It's done into folders and buses or groups, whatever. It's kind of the same thing in Bitwig. Anyway, obviously, it's just like a drums channel, etc. And, you've got your basses and whatnot, and appropriately named music. For lack of a better name, I called it music because it's just atmospheres, synths, whatever. Then I got some I got a Foley group. I decided to just do that separately from the drums, because you'll see, because that is actually one of the main sort of themes of the track as well, which is kind of why I wanted it to be its own thing, so I could sort of focus on it being a pretty prominent feature. Then effects, whatever, which is quite simple actually. Anyway, so I suppose the first thing I ought to talk about is where I started with the track, really, and that was in fact this Foley thing, which I'll show you what it sounds like. I'll show you what it sounds like. It sounds like this. Actually, I'll take the sidechain off briefly. So it sounds like this. Yeah, just under that, and that is essentially just some Foley, which I've actually found the file used to make this here, which I've chopped up, made some interesting groove out of it, which I thought it was a good basis for the track because it did set the theme, and it gave me a good rhythmical starting point to work with, because obviously you can start with drums, but it can be a bit tiring, and sometimes you want to break the norm a bit. And I think you still, as it's drum and bass, it's still a good idea to work with things rhythmically. So this was quite a nice starting point. Anyway, this is what the original file sounded like. It's just sort of this thing. Yeah, just like that really, and there's various bits and pieces that are very similar. I'll show you kind of what I've done. This is what it sounds like without the processing, this group. Nope, that's not how it sounds, just how it sounds. I've got to take the side chain off again. Yeah, this is how it sounds. Yeah, so that's it. And I went about processing this in a way that I didn't want to change it too much. I wanted to keep it rhythmically the same, because obviously there's a reason I like the groove, but it needed some tonal shifting. Otherwise, it's not gonna kind of fit in a track really, especially a drum and bass track, I think. So as it's quite all over the place dynamically, so I used a compressor to just sort of tame that, because it's Foley, so it's very peaky. There's no sort of consistency there's not much consistency in levels really, so I just used the compressor to tame it a bit. And obviously, actually, you may have heard that it's recorded in such a way that it's more present on one side, then the other side's almost got a sort of room mic. So I need to I need to make it more consistent. So I'll show you how it sounded before, just in case you didn't pick it up. I'll pan it or something quickly. It's kind of a bit more almost roomy on one side, and on one's a bit more, up front. So it needed more consistency. So I actually modded it, which in early stages will sound pretty bad, because this kind of thing you could do kind of one wide, but for not this kind of width, really, it wouldn't really work in the context of a drum and bass track. So it just sounds like that. I wanted to give it some more tone as well, because it's quite a tonally, in a way, bland sound. It's not going to necessarily cut through so nicely in the mid range or whatever in a track in the grand scheme of things. So I use this thing called a resonator bank, which essentially just EQ, really. It's an acoustic modelling thing, really, but it's essentially just like taking a bunch of things and just resonating them, sort of like doing this, whatever, which you can do as well, but it's quite nice to work with the Bitwig one, to be honest, because it's like already there, It's kind of, and it sounds like this. It does have a certain sound to it, which I think is quite nice, and it just gives it a bit more kind of it almost sounds like a wood block or something, like if you're scraping along a wood block, just tonally, with that sort of mid-range sort of spikes. And it just helped cut through the mix a bit. I also use this ring mod thing, which is a kilohertz one. It's very, very good. It makes your sound. You can essentially make it a stereo with the ring mod, because it will essentially, the more you put the spread up, it turns it into a sort of auto pan thing. So the frequency that you're modulating the ring mod at, it will sort of go left and right at that speed, essentially. And it's good if you want to introduce some more width. Sounds like that, really. It does alter the timbre of the sound a bit, but not necessarily a bad thing. I think that's also a good thing to remember, is that good stereo imaging, it doesn't come from making things, just trying to make things stereo. It often has to come from a sort of, I don't know, like a genuine direction, I suppose. It does have to be purpose. It has to be a sort of stereo as a effect or something. Otherwise, it's like the Haas effect. You can't really use that in drum and bass because it's not mono compatible. So you need to go about making sure that things, adding things in a way that it will make it stereo as a side effect, but it will also alter the timbre of the sound in the way that you want it to. It has to be, as I said, it just has to be stereo as a sort of side effect of that, or as another important factor as to why you've added it. So I think it's just good to remember that. Then some just transient shape and whatever, just to tame it down a bit, make it a bit more tight. Then I've also used distortion, which I think is just sort of flattening it a bit again. It's just sort of evening it out, which is very good, because this kilohertz one here, again, it's got dynamics control. You're going to see these kilohertz plugins a lot. Actually, they're very, very good. I recommend using them. It's got this dynamics control that is very, very useful. Which again, similar to the stereo effect with the ring mod, you have, if you want to make something dynamically tamed with a distortion, you have to be prepared to want the actual character of the distortion as well. So it has to be, again, sort of either a side effect of either, I suppose, either sort of what you want, I suppose. It has to be a side effect of what you want, but also you have to, I don't know. It's hard to put into words. I'm kind of babbling. I won't go into it too much. Then it's just a bit more dynamic taming. It's just a bit crazy, but It's just smoothing it out of it because it was probably a bit sharp maybe in the context of the mix. Saturation, which is more dynamic smoothing. Yeah, as you can see, this is probably something you're going to see quite a bit because it is, it's just one of those sounds that is very dynamic. So then some cleaning up with EQ. I mean that's it. I mean I've gone on for way too long about this already, but I mean it's that's the fundamental concept of this. It's very disjointed, and sort of it's quite wonky and mechanical, and this is exactly where this idea came from. Because I started with this groove set up that rhythmical concept that I wanted to follow. That is that really. I suppose the next thing I went on to do is the drums, because now I have the rhythmical idea, I need the drums to sort of, set in concrete what I'm doing. So the drums are very simple actually. It's just these layers, and that's literally it. And it's a very, very simple kick as well. It doesn't actually even have any processing on it, which is I won't go in depth too much about how I made this kick because it's not particularly important, to be honest. It's just a sine wave with some pitch drop. I use two LFOs even on pitch because one create thump and one create a transient. So this one here is doing the thump. As you can see, it's LFO2. It's going down from a slightly lower point than LFO3. So this is going down from about 200 hertz above or something, then down to the root note, which is I guess D or something. I don't know. Or no, A sharp even. Yeah. So yeah, and then there's the other one, which is a very, very quick envelope, which is going from higher, which creates that sort of slightly more interesting texture on the transient, really. Hang on, put that back on. So if you listen to it without that, it wouldn't sound so cool. This sounds a bit sort of lacks the presence that it needs. Gives it a bit more interesting of a transient, really. And that's it for the kick. Nothing crazy going on. Snare again is a similar thing, really. It's just, this processing isn't really anything I need to talk about here. It's all quite subtle, not really doing anything drastically important to the tutorial, really. It's the same thing, really. It's just higher and it's got noise. That's literally it, Although I only use one envelope for the actual transient or the pitch drop, I suppose you could say, because it doesn't need that thump that kicks have, because the transient needs to be faster anyway. So it's just one LFO going from a very, very high frequency down to the root frequency. That's it. Then there's some noise going, just got this shape, which is a good thing to remember. Cutting out a bit of noise at the start is good because it makes space for the transient and sounds a bit cleaner, it doesn't sound so sort of like old school 808 TD, old school 808 drum machine or whatever, So yeah. Then you've got the filter built into Serum that is cutting out the low end from the noise, really. And that's just that, really. There's nothing particularly interesting going on there. But the other thing is the snaps here. That these are quite cool because they're sort of alternating. I just recorded these on my iPhone 6, believe it or not. And it's quite easy to do, actually. You could very easily do it from home. It's you just take several takes of you just sort of clicking, doing you just do that, and then you just do that several times, several takes, and you layer those takes back over with each other, and you would then make them different layers, stereo, left and right, so you can get that stereo information. I probably don't think I've made that very clear, but you'll see what I mean here. It's sort of separated into different transients, so you so if you're taking several takes, you can essentially, it won't always be exactly in time, so you can essentially get these sort of snappy sort of sounds because they are slightly out of sync. But then it'll still sound dead mono because the iPhone obviously only records in mono. So to get it stereo, you would just pan certain takes left and right, so you get that stereo information. It's a good idea to make sure that I think your main transient is sort of pretty mono though, otherwise it won't really cut through so much at the front, I suppose. Yeah, that's pretty much it, and that combined just makes this thing. And the way it varies is quite nice as well, I think. It just gives it a bit more, I don't know, it just doesn't sound so straight, which is good. That's what you want to do. There's nothing really interesting going on with these hats. It's just noise and bits and bobs, you know. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, so I suppose the bass. What can I do about the bass? So the bass, it's pretty simple really. It's just, so you've got the highs. I've split it up into layers. I've got this high end because this obviously doesn't really, this subby layer doesn't really provide any high end. So in combination like this. Yeah, like that. And it's yeah, I don't know. The main sound of it is pretty simple, really. It's just like a sub bass and some harmonics, which is just, you know, literally just this. It's a sine wave, literally nothing else. It's just a sine wave. Then we've got some harmonics, which are essentially it's just again sine waves. Well, near enough sine waves. But it's kind of detuned, it's got more voices and stuff, so it's giving that sort of wide chorusy effect, which yeah, definitely adds to the vibe in my opinion. It gives it more vibe, sounds less straight, you know, it's good. It's is that the best I can say? It's good. And I've also got this macro, which is gradually bringing up the FM from oscillator B. Oscillator B is also an octave higher and is a bit detuned from the original one, so it gives it a bit more like imperfections, as it has more imperfections when the FM starts coming in essentially. And I'm just automating that in gradually on each take, I suppose you could say. Then, you know, I just EQ'd out unnecessary frequencies, you know, it's fairly bog standard stuff. Compressed it to make sure it's a bit more stable. Yeah, but I say the most interesting bit of this section is these mid basses here. They are realistically the same patch, you know, well, very very similar to patch really. It's fundamentally the same. It's just like different configuration of pitch, and there's also another oscillator chucked into the mix, which is it's essentially FM from the sub to this one, then which is then being FM to this one, so you get some more interesting harmonics. But I think the most interesting thing about this bass is it sounds like this one, which in fact is the same as this one, so I'm going to talk about this one instead. Yeah, in fact this is ignore me, this is almost even closer to this one configuration wise, just the same, you know, it's just 2 octaves instead. But the interesting thing about this one is its sound comes from the ring mod, so just sounds like that, which does sound good, but I thought it was more interesting with these sort of more sawtooth characteristics in it. Sounds like this. And that's literally, it's quite interesting, I think, because it is so kind of detuned. And the ring mod is self-modulating, and because it's detuned, it becomes really hard for it to oscillate on a single note, because it isn't a single note. The bass is conflicting between 2 slightly different notes, which means that when it self-oscillates on the ring mod, you get all these phasing. You get a bunch of like phasing, which creates these movements. These sort of as you can kind of hear, they're like little micro movements. It just creates these really interesting textures, in my opinion. And it's it's a cool thing to do. I just think making sure that it's just these little imperfections that which you can sort of really bring out with plugins like distortions and ring mods, etc. Anything that's going to accentuate little movements is really, really good to mess around with, because that's ultimately where a lot of the character of a sound will come from, if it is a rhythmically focused sound. I've got another ring mod here which is just making it stereo, really. Yeah, literally just making it stereo. Nothing particularly interesting else on there. I mean, there's some distortion, but that's fairly bog standard. But the other thing was to create continuity of the track, but also keep it varied. I've just made different variations of the same sound, which alternate each time, really. You'll hear it's just doing this. And they're all using pretty much the same techniques. Obviously, there's varying variation within the processing and stuff, but they're fundamentally the same things, really, and that's kind of what ties them together, but keeps it varied because they are still different sounds, essentially. That's kind of the key to it, really, because it's a simple track. There's not that many layers. It's a simple track, and that's kind of what you have to do to keep simple tracks interesting. It needs to be kept very. It needs to have links between sounds. They need to be linked, but they need to still be different enough that it doesn't get boring. And it's quite a hard thing to achieve sometimes. I think it's quite a hard balance to get right. I think that leads quite nicely onto the second theme, well, the second drop of the track, which I actually speak about a bass in the first drop first, so you can sort of know where the second thing comes from, really. So if you've heard the track, you'll recognise that there's this big sort of a bwum on it, like every sort of, whatever that is, I don't know. But yeah, that one. So this is just, it's like a accompanying part. It's not the focus of the track. It's just I don't know, like a minor character in a play or something like that. And it's I've essentially wanted to reuse it in a different way in the second drop, because I do like the sound, and it's I wanted to make the second drop different from the first drop. I wanted it to be quite different, but it needed that connection to the first drop. So I reused the same sound, but I just sort of reimagined it, I suppose. It sounds like this. You'll recognise it. It just goes a bit hectic, It sounds like this. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to do, because it's like it's the same sound, so it's a recognisable thing, and it keeps that continuity going throughout the track. And obviously, rhythmically, it's still used on similar sort of beats. It comes in on similar timing, so you still get that sort of boom, but then it sort of moves out. Essentially, it moves into something bigger. That's kind of how I achieved the continuity between the two things. And another thing for keeping the track interesting, it's a good idea to add elements of if you want to make something interesting, it's quite a good idea to constantly make things either get bigger or just really, really change the dynamic, or make it really, really minimal or something. With this one, I tried to make it a bit more big, and I tried to make it bigger and sort of scarier in a way. And one of the things that really helped achieve that was this pad here, which is called the horror pad. It's quite an easy thing to do, this kind of thing, actually. This is basically just, I think it's an arpeggiator, arpeggio or something, which I've essentially put through a time stretch, and this time stretcher is called Pull Stretch. It's very, very good. I recommend you try it. It's very good for pads and such like. It essentially time stretches things by a very, very high fidelity. But in order for it to do that, it essentially blurs the sound a lot, because it can't retain the quality for it to be that crisp. It has to be blurred, which is obviously very, very good for pads, because pads aren't supposed to be crisp things. They're meant to be blurred sort of washes of sound. It's brilliant because you just create some weird sort of atonal pad or something, and it will merge those notes in interesting harmonic relationships and stuff, and it just creates these nice big washes that have all these strange characteristics. It can be very, very cool. And I've used it for this, and as you can hear, it's kind of it reminds you of all those sort of horror films with all those sort of stabby sort of those stabby violins, like The Shining or whatever. And it's I think it's The Shining. I can't remember. I can't say I've watched it. But or reminiscent of like Knife Party, Centipede. It's like the build up in that. It's cool. It's good to have inspirations from those sides of things. It creates sort of familiar and relatable sounds, which are good for listeners, I suppose. Yeah, so that's what I want to talk about there. I mean, it's not really a huge amount else here. Yeah, I think that's it really. I mean, the other cool thing was on the topic of pull stretch actually was the vocal here. This is just like a vocal which I put through pull stretch. As you can see, it's made it very, very washed out. It's a good example of how that's done. I think the most interesting thing about this sound actually was it's quite subtle, but the way it sort of pans left and right a bit. It pans in quite a natural way that I don't think you'd achieve just by automating the pan or something. It's weirdly done through essentially automating the amount that something's being time stretched within pull stretch. So there's an automation grid on pull stretch which you can automate, and it changes the percentage of how much it's being time stretched, obviously per how much the graph is moving or whatever. And it's really cool because it just creates these side effects of it panning and repetitions and stuff, which would be really hard to achieve just from an actual manually doing that. It'd be really, really hard to do. It just created a cool sound. I thought it was just nice to hear. Created some cool ambiences, but also gave them a bit of edge, which is good. Other than that, I don't think there's anything else to talk about really. What else did I talk about? I suppose since it's quite back on the topic of it being very disjointed, there's a lot of pauses and stuff in it which are useful if you want to create some mechanical sound. So as you can see, it's sort of done. So you can see every 8 bars it's got this one beat or one bar pause, which is good because you don't only want to do these sort of short mechanical sort of micro edits. You want to generally create a mechanical feel, which large scale, small scale, whatever, they can all combine to create something very cool in the bigger picture. I think it's just good to consider those things, It's sort of in between like micro and macro pauses. These sidechain edits I did, which I thought created a very cool effect, I think. And it's essentially just using the sidechain trigger in places where there aren't drums to create these rhythmical stutters, which sound like this. Wait, hang on. just created more variations, which is nice. It gave it a nice groove, nice sort of progression. Yeah, it's interesting. Without it, you notice it sounds significantly more bland, I think. It's just missing something, and these little stutters just add something quite cool, I think. That's a good thing to remember. I mean, even if you're not making a particularly mechanical sounding track, sidechain is a very good sound design tool as well as a mixing tool, and it can be very nice to use it in a sort of creative aspect like that, really. Yeah. So I suppose that's about it. I hope this was useful. I know I'm probably not the best at explaining everything, but I hope there was some good insight into the track, and I hope you enjoyed what I've said. If you thought I was rubbish, please tell me. That would be brilliant, because feedback is your friend. Yes. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. I'll hopefully see you again for another tutorial in the not so distant future. Thank you very much. Goodbye.